Welcome to Invisible, Breaking Through the Stigma of Addiction. I'm Dean Anderson. I am an addiction counselor, an advocate, and the host of the show. Today, we have our very first guest is Mike Hannon. Mike Hannon is the Director of Substance Use Dependency from Westover Treatment Center. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
You're welcome.
So Mike has been in the field. Mike, you've been in the field for a whole bunch of years, at least 30 years of experience with working with addiction and substance use. What does that look like? What has that looked like in the 30 years, the progression, and, what's the current face of addiction?
I think the progression has been, from what I've seen, is toward a youthful movement. There are people who are younger who are experiencing issues, but more importantly, there are people who are younger who are reaching out for help for those issues. When I was first involved, it was in my own personal recovery, and you go to any kind of a 12-step meeting, and it was always like a bunch of old guys, it seemed like. And what we're seeing now in the treatment field, a lot of very, very young people, like their demographic, I think age-wise, has really dropped as far as people seeking help. So I don't know what message is out there for them, but they seem to understand the need for help at a much younger age than they had been. And there's a lot more mental health issues associated with substance use disorder than there had been before. It's a lot of it is a self-medication aspect, I think, that people are starting to be aware of it. But yeah, a lot of issues in the young people.
Do you think that the increase in mental health issues are just the access to diagnosis? Do you think it's an increase in something in society, or is it just what do you think that it might be that's causing that influx?
Well, I think for a lot of it, not being able to be a diagnostician to say one way or another, but I think some of it is the fact that there's an anomaly happening now that wasn't happening 30 years ago, and that is we have now third and fourth generations of people in chemical dependence, addiction type, as opposed to just alcoholics. We have hardcore addicts that are now like third and fourth generation. So I'm not sure if some of that might have an impact on the mental health of people, their substance use through their formative years and whatnot of family members.
I can see that, how that would be impactful, because the idea of it being a family disease, and that there's coping mechanisms passed down through generations, and genealogy and all those other things that can play a contributing factor. And then now, of course, it's much more accessible to understand more of the hardcore drugs, and they're easily to get at and communicate and text message and do all those things to make it accessible to you. So I could see that. Yeah. So what is the function of residential treatment? So the program that you do, how does that work with this?
Well, our philosophy, if you will, around addiction is primarily very little of it has to do with the substance. The substance is the issue when people come, but recovery is about not returning to the substance, trying to find a different way to meet the need that the substance was meeting. And our belief is that a large part of what addiction is about is disconnection. People feel disconnected in some way, shape, or form. How it happened or whatever is immaterial. A lot of people want to attribute it to trauma. There's a lot of talk about trauma. Did it cause it, or did it just reinforce it? It's immaterial. What we want to do here at Westover, and what our program is designed to do, is help people start to build a sense of connection with others that ultimately will lead to a sense of connection with themselves. And when I say with themselves, I mean the self that they were before the addiction took over and started to challenge their self-esteem and their feelings of belonging and wholeness.
Just like that. Check it. Yeah, there's a not to oversimplify it, absolutely not, but yeah, I mean, that's what it comes down to. It comes down to connection and being able to help people find themselves and heal at the level that they want to heal at, right?
Well, ultimately, Dean, the solution is simple. It's just for really complicated people.
Here, I got
Yeah.
that right with you. Um, so there's also a vision of residential treatment, and there's something that people look at it in the sense that um, when you hear residential treatment, it's always rehab, right?
Yeah.
And I know that there's some stigma around that as well, and there's an idea that it's for the worst of the worst. Um,
Mhm.
can you tell me, your impressions of that, or what makes that wrong or right?
Well, I think the reason there's impressions around that, quite simply, is because um, how addiction has been portrayed in media or movies or whatever. There's sort of been a glorification of the worst parts of it, and so that gives people the belief that everybody who says I have an addiction issue is either living under a bridge or walking around with a paper bag or whatever. And so that's the belief. And if you've got to go to rehab, then you're the lowest of the low and the whole bit. And all it's about is learning some life skills. I had a client actually today say to me that they told their family they were going to life college because see that's a big part of what residential treatment here at Westover is about anyway. Is teaching people the requisite skills to be able to communicate to their feelings, which helps them create connection with their loved ones and their family members and the people in their lives. They can find a different way of expressing and accepting themselves. And so that's something that they need to understand. And I've literally had a brain surgeon in treatment who thought he was better than everyone until he had about an hour conversation with an 18-year-old kid who was addicted to crack. And his whole thing was after we're exactly the same people. We've just traveled a bit of a different journey. And so that understanding exists within inside the walls. It's trying to get that understanding outside the walls. And that'll only happen if we stop glorifying the horrific aspects of addiction and start to look at the humanity of the people involved.
Hmm. So by glorifying, are you referring to the media? You're referring to the way that we make it gangster, and we,
Yeah.
glorify it on social media and in the media, and we turn it into this bad thing to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's that whole sense of judgment of in regards to it. And one of the things that clients have when if you're actually providing treatment within a treatment setting is one thing they will not feed is judgment.
yes. Yeah. So then it contributes to the whole cycle of shame and all that stuff that goes along with that as
All
well.
the stuff that disconnects.
Yes. Last question for you, Mike. I know that you have ceremonies every week, and you have groups that come in out of there. People are leaving there. You have a commencement, so a new beginning, and people leave the facility. What are the words of wisdom that you share each week with those people when they're leaving the building?
The one message I have this asked to me many times. The one message I want to give people is I hope when they leave our center, they leave with the belief that they deserve a better life than they have allowed themselves to have. That way, should they get off track at some point, they'll be able to look themselves in the mirror and say, you know what, I deserve better than I've allowed myself to have, and step back on the tracks of recovery and start to do the work to live that better life that they actually do deserve.
Awesome. I appreciate that, Mike. Thank you so much for being on the show and sharing all your wisdom. And we'll be sure to have you back again sometime.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve.
Our second guest is somebody that I look up to personally. He is a university professor at King's College. He's a PhD, MSW, RSW, has a whole bunch of letters behind his names, has quite literally written the textbook for some of the university programs on addiction. Welcome to the show, Rick Cernick.
Thank you very much, Dean. Glad to be here with you today.
I'm so happy that you are here and that you agreed to be on the show. I think that there's a wealth of knowledge that you have to share, and I just can't wait to tap into it. Rick, one of the biggest things that I've learned, or what I learned initially when I went into university, was that some of the language and the dialogue I was using around addiction was inappropriate is the best way that I can describe it. And I was caught off guard when I was writing papers and doing things, and the professor or the TA would come back and say, "Yeah, this isn't the good language to use," and I had to change my way of thinking, my dialogue around it. Can you help me understand a little bit more about that dialogue around addiction and the stuff that was inappropriate for me to use?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, right off the bat, though, addiction is a fascinating field because nobody owns it. I mean, there's all sorts of professionals that work it. I'm a social worker, I have a psychology background, I've got a degree in biology. So there are doctors and nurses and addiction specialists and social workers and psychologists, psychometrists, all sorts of people work in this field. But we're late to the show. I mean, professional people really came much after peers came into it. I mean, the foundation for the way we help people in North America is really Alcoholics Anonymous in the AA movement and NA, Narcotics Anonymous, that grew out of it. And so those people self-named themselves, right? And this is back in the day, really 1935, when the movement really picked up. And so they called themselves addicts, right? And it was to discern themselves. They felt like outsiders. The society treated them like outsiders. And so they needed something to bond. I mean, form together very much at us versus them, because society saw them as discarded, right? As rummies, as vagabonds, all sorts of negative names. And so addict became actually a positive name. Jump forward to the 21st century, and very much those of us in the helping professions don't ever want to see a person as a thing. And so an addict is a thing. And so we always want to see the person, because the person with an addiction issue is, again, cliche, mother, brother, sister, pastor, university professor, truck driver, wife of the president of the United States. So we want to see the individual as a person first. So the term addict, what we say in universities anyways, objectifies a person, doesn't see them as a whole individual. So I tell my students is person with an addiction, you put the person first and you put the label aside.
Absolutely. That's a big change for anybody to grasp onto. How are we to try and incorporate this into the rest of the world, or I mean, how do we
Yeah.
change that dialogue so that, I mean, it's 1935, it's a long time ago.
I mean, it's a difficult concept because, again, because we have people in different professions with different ideas. Again, as social workers, as counselors, we're always looking to see the whole person. The term addiction itself, though, is just fascinating because it's become trivialized. I'm addicted to caffeine. I'm addicted to exercise. I'm addicted to these things. And addiction is so much more of a complex issue than that. I mean, there are three distinct components, and some people will say there's four distinct components. And so one is the biological piece to it, right? So there's this notion of who you are as an individual, your biological makeup, your genetics, your hair color, the way you metabolize things. So those things you really can't control over. Your mom and dad gave them to you, their parents gave them to you, you're stuck with your genetics, right? But that's a core way that your body responds whenever you put a drug into it. Then there's the psychological makeup of it. And so your personality, how you cope with stress, how you deal with trauma, how you're overwhelmed. And of course, in today's society, we appreciate things like post-traumatic stress disorder, trauma. We used to call things like shell shock. We used to minimize these, but we know there are things that happen to everyone, to all of us, that have the capability of overwhelming our coping mechanisms. And then there's our social context. I mean, where you're living, the fact that we're in Canada and we're not in the southern United States, we're not in Ecuador, we're not in Sierra Leone. That environment shapes the way we respond to situations. So this is why for us, language, for me anyway, language is so important, because a person has made up these components in this intersection. And when you add a psychoactive drug, be it alcohol, be it fentanyl, be it Ritalin, when you add that to the mix, is that it's so easy to just discard the person without seeing all the elements that came to lead them from someone that can use drugs in a controlled manner to someone where the drug has taken control of them. And to dismiss them with a label of 6 letters, not understand the complexity, it's so easy then to discard all the issues that surround them that led them to that point in time. Because Dean, you and I know no one at the age of 12 goal is, hey, I'd like to become addicted to drugs. That's no one's real goal in life. So
Mhm.
again, to use the A word, to use that label, diminishes everything they've gone through to that point in time, and then diminishes our role as helpers to help them move forward from there.
Hmm. So it all encompassing, and
Yeah.
every aspect of the person is impacted, but we're trying to make it so that it's coming from the whole person, not that the whole person has become that thing. Uh,
Yeah, and that's it. And no one wants to be a thing, right? No one wants to be a thing. I had the privilege of working with some athletes past in my career. And the funny thing working with athletes as they retire is they don't want to be known as athletes. One guy in particular was an all-star and again had some personal issues, but he wanted to be known for the fact that he graduated from university. He had really good grades, and that the average person just saw him as a jock was actually offensive to him because he wanted to see them as now as a businessman, right? And so everyone knew this name and everyone associated him with his accomplishments, but he was more than just that one thing people saw. And it's the same thing in addiction. You just see someone that is having difficulty, that may have lost their job or been divorced or is no longer in contact with their family. But there's all sorts of background to this. And this is where this notion of stigma and labeling comes from, is that we don't know the backstory. Like in every good movie, there's a backstory that you want to get in touch with the characters. The same thing in addiction. To learn the backstory is to learn that person and to see them more than just as a label.
so also looking at the idea of once you give them that label, there's difficulty with moving forward because then that kind of keeps the person stuck in that position, like you said with the sports player.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is the other issue in society, again, because Alcoholics Anonymous was the way to help people, and it has been extremely successful. I'm not a member of the fellowship. I still attend meetings because you can go as a professional, open meetings and be a support, be an allied individual, or just go and educate yourself about them. But if we were to do heart surgery in 2021, the way we did in 1935, some of those techniques still work, but a lot of them don't. And the same thing for AA. Some of the basic ideas, the basic model, there's some great value in that. But if we haven't learned anything since 1935, then there's something wrong with me as an academic, as a professor, not researching, not teaching, not educating more. So good foundation, good beginnings, but we've moved beyond that in terms of some of our thinking and some of the ways we talk to people and interact with individuals.
So there's something that you said at the very beginning when you first started talking, and you said something about us being late to the game.
Yeah.
What prevented us? What took us so long to get our gear on and step up to the plate?
Well, people for the longest time, and unfortunately, a good percentage of the population still thinks developing addiction is the person's fault, right? It's your fault. I can have a drink and I don't fall down drunk. I haven't lost my family. What's wrong with you? So there's that blaming of individuals. And when you blame someone long enough, when you tell someone long enough that in fact one president didn't win the election, the other one who didn't get as much votes won the election, people start thinking that may be the truth. And so if you tell someone long enough that they're a bad person, their behavior is shameful, that they're a disappointment to their family, if I tell you that day after day, year after year, you start believing that, you start owning that. And so that's society for the longest time. And when I say longest time, I would say arguably our mindset didn't start shifting in any way until the 1980s. Um, is that you believe it. A generation believes it. Society believes it. And so if you've believed something for centuries, and now we've been at this for a couple of decades trying to change ideas, sure, it's slow moving. Of course, now we have different media. We have programs like yours that are trying to educate people, but it's still a slow process when something's been ingrained in us
Mhm.
to believe it. Even when you take back and I'm going to use this word seriously. You look at the science, you look at the knowledge, you look at the difference between what was believed and what is known. You see it's much more than these issues. So professionals really didn't appreciate the need for us to get involved. There was really no addiction profession again until about 40 years ago, and it's evolved. And then professions like mine, social work and psychology, really didn't provide lots of care and even my own education, you told me how many degrees I have, which is lovely to pat back. But I went through my entire university career, which was 12 years, full time and part time, but didn't have one class on addiction. All of my teaching and ability came post university, take the knowledge I had and saying, if we put these pieces together, this is why we can make a change in society.
Wow. So I'm hearing that there's stigma, there's shame, there's these bits that are around those that dialogue, the words that we use. and that contributes to the shame. Now, somebody had said on a previous episode, they said something in regards to, we want to change society, but we need to remember that we are society.
Yeah.
And it really resonated with me, and it stuck with me. So even the people that are dealing with addiction and using and changing that, so the people out there listening right now who are in recovery, it's a good idea to try and look at changing some of that dialogue, the way that you label and talk about yourself. What I would love to ask some more, Rick, is about how shame, the actual shame and stigma, impacts addiction in that sense of perpetuating forward motion.
I want to give you an example. Again, I began working in the field in 1986. And I've been around so long is that HIV was still called AIDS, right? We would go home on a Friday, we'd come back on Monday, and some of our clients, they have passed away. That was just the nature of it. Now, HIV is something that still occurs. We try and prevent it, but we have met, you don't die from it any longer. It's now an illness as opposed to a fatality. And so that attitude has changed. People are out, there's protesting. You've got stars like Elton John came out, making a big deal for it. We had fundraisers, we have gay pride, we have all sorts of programming around that. In 2021, the two of the most well-known peer-driven support systems are Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. They're still anonymous. And again, I want to be very clear. I support them. I go to meetings. I have good friends that have long recovery histories. We have great conversations. They get mad at me. I get mad at them. But it's 1921. Why are we still anonymous? Why are we still hiding as opposed to saying hi? One of the most beautiful things I saw, and I read about this in class, it's an obituary. And it's about 3 years ago. And I read it because the young girl that died is the same age as my older son. And her parents put the obituary, how much they loved their child, how much she struggled with addiction, how much she recovered, went back and forth. And no matter what they couldn't help her with, they still love her, right? And putting that in public saying, my child had an addiction. It's something we as parents couldn't help her with, but didn't diminish who she was. She's still a good person. She'll still love. She'll still our child, and we mourn her. I mean, that's the message that I want to hear now. Because if you have an addiction, you're not a rummy. You're not a derelict. You're not a bum or a hobo. You're a person with value, and people love you.
And I got nothing to say after that, Rick. That was a perfect ending. Thank you so much for being on the show. I appreciate everything that you do, the work that you do, the research you do, and the books that you write. Thank you so much. And hopefully we can have you back again.
Dean, I appreciate being on the first show. I hope the ratings don't plummet because of me. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rick. Mike and Rick are two of the smartest guys I know when it comes to talking about addiction and substance use. There was something that Mike said that really stood out, and paired with the information that Rick shared today, I want to look at what Mike said about it being simple. It's something that's very simple. We just make it complicated. And he's right in a way. It is a simple process. It's a simple idea. We're looking at emotions and the inability to cope with those emotions. And it should be a pretty simple process of saying, I just need to learn how to deal and cope with my emotions instead of using drugs and alcohol. Simple deal, right? But something that Rick said is we need to look at this from a biopsychosocial standpoint. And the biopsychosocial standpoint means that in order for addiction to have a true hold on somebody, it has to impact them biologically. So that's in their physical body, the chemicals in the brain. Maybe it's pain management. Psychologically, the way they think, their coping, mental health. And socially, how it impacts their life from their inner circles, the relationships and the things that are happening to them, and who are in their lives to support them or not support them. There's also a spiritual component, which could be a mind-body connection, or just having hope and faith that things are going to work out the way that they're supposed to. All of those things play an impact and a role on the ability to cope in our everyday life. They all overlap each other. They all impact each other. When I'm working out and I'm healthy at the gym, I feel good mentally. When I feel good mentally, I'm more prone to go for a walk or eat something healthy. All of those things impact the life of everybody. And essentially, that's the model of perfect health, to be well biologically, psychologically, socially, and spiritually. Those things are all going to contribute to the ability to have a healthy lifestyle and to be able to cope, reducing the stress so that there's less to cope from, and building resiliency so you can cope better. Those things are difficult to do when you look at it from that perspective, because it can look as though you have to make major changes to your life. Simple, but profound, and lots to it, lots to the picture. And then being able to understand and see where those areas of development are for you, or what those barriers are, or what strengths you might have in order to achieve those goals, or even setting the goals in the first place. And when you don't know these things, when you have never been raised, or you don't have the knowledge and the know-how to deal with that, then it's natural that you would need support or help to figure those things out. So Mike's right. It's pretty simple, but at the same time, it's difficult. And that's how we get in our own way, because the hardest thing to overcome is emotions. We all know that, right? So remember, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is right now. Thanks for watching.